Hello, everybody. We're here to talk to you about essential ocean variables for sustained observations of marine biodiversity and ecosystems. This is going to be a joint presentation by Gabrielle Canonico and by myself on behalf of the Global Ocean Observing System and also the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network. I am Frank Muller-Karger. I'm an oceanographer at the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg, Florida. And I'm one of the co-chairs of the MBON, the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network.
And I am Gabrielle Canonico. I am part of the U.S. Integrated Ocean Observing System program. I'm also co-chair of the Global Ocean Observing System Biology and Ecosystem Panel and the coordinator of the U.S. Marine Biodiversity Observation Network.
There are very, very large investments in ocean observing systems around the world, and yet we don't really have a good way to understand how life in the sea is changing. And one of the things that we would like to understand is exactly how life is changing because we ourselves depend so much on marine life. So one of the objectives of having this partnership between different observing groups is to obtain good and timely information about marine biodiversity and understand how these ecosystems are changing, because with that, changes are occurring that affect our own economy and our health. This is what we can get today in terms of a global picture. Satellites give us a really good, almost daily picture of how patterns are changing in terms of temperature, winds. And one of the things that we can relate to biology is the color of the ocean, basically by looking at the chlorophyll distribution. So that's an index of biomass. But there's not very much information on biodiversity itself. So what kind of fish, what kind of plankton, what kind of shrimp or other types of organisms are in the ocean and how that's changing. And that is something that we would like to understand. But the reality is that the in situ databases that we have, especially the open databases like the Ocean Biodiversity Information System, are not very complete. Here, for example, is a representation of the number of records that we have in OBIS over the past 100+ years. And in the surface ocean, basically in the upper 20 meters of the ocean, we find that most of the ocean doesn't even have any observations. So there are very few places around coastal zones, and especially in the industrialized areas, where we have a little bit more data. But if we look at these graphics on the right-hand side, the top graphic shows that there's a decrease in the information that we have that goes into these databases over the past 5 to 10 years. And so if we want to understand change, we would like to update these databases on a routine basis. And the same thing happens when we look at space. So if we go from north, from the Arctic to Antarctica, we can see that the polar zones have a lot less data than the tropical or temperate areas. And if we go deeper into the ocean, which is not shown in this graph, the information also decreases. So we need to, the whole point of trying to organize these observing systems is to address the need for timely and space information. So that's where we want to develop a community of practice and to try to network observing systems around the world. There's a number of regional efforts. A lot of them are focused on physics and biogeochemistry, and we would like to engage those observing systems in measuring biology, because in the end, the reason that a lot of the physical and chemical measurements are made is to try to understand how these changes are affecting life. And so we want to do this in coastal zones, in exclusive economic zones, and out to the high seas, not only to understand where you need to have marine protected areas, but also to monitor the effectiveness of anything that we're trying to do to conserve these ecosystem services. Eventually, all of this is important because we need to manage our own behavior or understand what we need to do to understand resilience of these ecosystems and how those ecosystems support our blue economy. So these observing systems eventually provide data in data sets, and that we would like to filter either by taxonomy or some other metric of diversity in space and in time to make maps. And these maps can change in time to tell us something about the abundance and the trends in different types of organisms over time. The way that we want to organize this is through what we're calling essential variables. And there are essential climate variables, for example, to track how climate is changing. So you measure a few very key parameters in an efficient and cost-effective way. Now we have defined essential ocean variables, which is what Gabrielle is going to talk about. And from the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network side, we're working under the umbrella of GeoBON, the Geo Biodiversity Observation Network, to define essential biodiversity variables. And these are all linked. These are not completely independent frameworks. They're completely interlinked. So for example, here we have on the right-hand side, we have the Group on Earth observations where GeoBON, Blue Planet, and the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network live, and we're defining the essential biodiversity variables. And on the other side, under the UNESCO side and the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, is the Global Ocean Observing System, and organizations like OBIS and the Ocean Teacher Global Academy and so on. Those are the systems that we need to network together to provide data integration and products for a very large number of users that also provide data to the same system. The essential biodiversity variables that are being defined under GeoBON effectively is this grayed out circle that has 6 different classes of what we call EBVs. The simplest, or for example, we have a genetic composition. We also want to know the populations that are based on the numbers on species itself, and community composition of these populations. Also ecosystem structure, ecosystem function, and species traits. So these are the 6 essential biodiversity variables that would be used to develop indicators, for example, to go and inform the Convention on Biological Diversity, Aichi targets, or whatever comes next after 2020, and also the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm going to pass it on to Gabrielle to talk about the essential ocean variables.
Thank you, Frank. This is a complicated graph, but I'll talk through it for a few moments. The Goose biology and ecosystem essential ocean variables were identified through extensive review of societal needs as identified by more than 20 international conventions and multilateral agreements that are relevant for marine life. The review also looked at the state of ocean observations measured by a number of observing programs, and the impact, feasibility, and scalability of variables that emerged from that analysis and how they contribute to addressing societal and scientific questions. The EOVs were selected based on their relevance in helping solve science questions and address societal needs both. The need for the information to manage marine resources and the feasibility of taking the measurements globally, looking at cost, available technologies, and also human resources to take the observations. So the set of EOVs that you see listed on the left of the graph represent functional groups that met these criteria, as well as a set of variables representing biogenic habitat state. These EOVs, again, grew from that process of exploring the needs of the users listed on the right of this chart, and they leverage the capabilities of the partners that are also listed here. So you can see there are very many number of players in this process. The slide can be viewed in 2 directions. So from the right to the left, the EOVs were born from a process that identified the needs and capabilities of users and partners. Now that we've identified this set of EOVs, we're working to determine how to implement them. That's viewing the graph from the left to the right, and to provide the information through those variables back to the users that need the information. So each EOV has a champion. Those are listed also in the chart. Some of these are evolving over time, but in some cases there are more than one champion for each variable. These are experts who are leading the development of specification sheets that help to guide implementation of each EOV. There's ongoing work on a number of these variables. and I'm just going to give a few examples. We recognize the importance of macroalgae as habitat, a nutrient source, even for mariculture, yet data to assess macroalgae at a global scale are collected using different methods in different places, and they're not fully aggregated. The situation is similar for sea plants, including seagrasses and mangroves. And for each of these EOVs, the expert teams have met in workshops to identify data sources, review methods, and plan next steps towards global monitoring and mapping efforts that are standardized and, again, global in coverage being a critical priority. There are other EOVs that are in discussion and in implementation. For the coral EOV, that team has identified a plan towards a common global strategy for coral reef monitoring and reporting that includes adoption of the EOV and EBV frameworks to identify priority variables for understanding and reporting on health of coral reefs, but also for mechanisms to improve delivery of those variables and the data. Another emerging EOV is ocean sound, which was discussed during a workshop last year and is recognized as a cross-cutting topic that could support all biological EOVs. An expert team has recently submitted a score proposal focused on visual census methods for nearshore benthic fish communities, and discussions have begun around deep ocean invertebrates as a first step in engaging the deep ocean community on biology and ecosystem EOVs. All of that to say that each one of the EOVs has a component of biodiversity that we have to map because all of life, including our own, depends on marine biodiversity. And because of this, we've taken steps and taken time to map the EOVs to the EBVs, including ecosystem function, genetic composition, habitat structure, and others. Again, this is a complicated chart, but we wanted to demonstrate the mapping activity and looking across different networks, different sets of variables, and how they interact. We've also taken steps over the past years to engage with existing ocean observing community partners to build on infrastructure that's in place and processes that already are working. These include the GOOS regional alliances as well as other GOOS components where ship-based, moored, or other observations are coordinated. Ultimately, the need for biodiversity information is to address social and economic questions, and our reliance on living marine resources for nutrition, recreation, subsistence, and many other reasons. So we really do need an understanding of biodiversity status and trends, and therefore we need the biodiversity time series, but significant gaps exist in our ability and resources to collect this information. Common methods for biodiversity science and observation, wider distribution of low-cost technologies, and expanded capacity along all the steps in the value chain are critical to addressing these challenges. Commitment to shared best practices is a really important step. This includes expanding the community of practice around marine biodiversity, observations, and science that considers user requirements for information generated from those efforts, ensures capacity of observers as well as users, and emphasizes the importance of interoperability and integration across disciplines to explain biodiversity, share information, and ultimately address critical social and economic needs. A number of groups have a role in this. Frank mentioned early in the talk how many of our efforts are interlinked. This graphic on this slide provides an example of some of those partnerships where, for example, the GOOS Biology and Ecosystem Panel and GOOS more broadly is very focused on requirements for sustained observations. MBON is very focused on the coordination of those observations and the partners that are taking them and using them, and also the promotion of best practices and capacity building. And OBIS is clearly very engaged in open data sharing and data integration efforts. But there are others listed here, and this is not a complete set, who have a need for the information, again, to support global biodiversity assessments, sustainable development goals, national needs for information on status and trends, that sort of thing. So this is an open invitation to join the community of practice Again, not interested in recreating the wheel, but very much interested in leveraging our collective efforts that are already in place, filling gaps where we need to, and doing a better and more consistent job of understanding biodiversity status and trends globally. Thank you.